Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thwack Camp 2024. I'm Kevin Klein.
And I am Kevin Sparenberg.
I'm the technical evangelist for databases here at SolarWinds.
And I am the community evangelist for our Thwack community.
Today, we're going to tell you all about DevOps and how it is augmented by a number of other methodologies, such as DataOps. So, since I'm a database guy, we started with DataOps and how it's much more than just DevOps for data. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. We're going to spend a few minutes explaining why DevOps, DataOps, and those kinds of process methodologies matter. They make a big difference to your bottom line. We're going to talk about the concept of shifting left, and then we'll talk about the different kinds of data governance and team governance in IT that is very common and needs to be more common, needs to be more widespread. So we're going to compare and contrast the origins and the effects, if you will, of data governance, DevOps, DataOps, and so forth. So why would we even want to change our methods and practices? Well, you know, in the old days, we didn't have data governance. We didn't have very strong methodologies designed to deliver products at speed. The old methodology that I worked under for decades, I started my career in the 80s at the tail end of the mainframes, and it was called waterfall. So you wouldn't begin one stage of a project until you had finished the previous stage. That turned out to be not only takes too long, but if you found out some new information towards the end of your project and had to make changes, it became extremely difficult. So it's not an adaptable process and not flexible.
The one thing that Waterfall has for you, though, is that Waterfall is very regimented. It's super easy to understand where one thing ends and the next one begins and then the next one after that. And when we started shifting to, I'm sure you're going to talk about Agile, when we started moving towards Agile development ideologies, all of a sudden that kind of turned into a nebulous cloud and everyone had to retrain their brains. I, for one, had to do that. I'm sure you went through something very similar.
What has happened over time when you look, especially when you're looking at data, we went for, when I started my career, in fact, for a long time, it was only called data processing. And it just did what accountants and scientists did, but a lot faster. And then we began to use this term of information technology. And that was kind of cool and new and different. We're managing information. They even called them knowledge management systems for a while. And now we have artificial intelligence. Well, once we started to move from those kind of transaction processing systems into more advanced forms of analytics on our data, what we found is that organizations that were leading the way in that space were constantly getting tripped up because there wasn't a top-down guidance. There wasn't any kind of centralized governance for the way they would do the construction of a data warehouse or a data lake. And so what would happen is you'd have the sales team talking to the marketing team, and then the sales team would be talking to the finance team for the general ledger profit and loss statements, and they use different words for the same thing, right? And sometimes they'd use the same word, but it would mean entirely different things.
I love that.
Yeah, yep. Exactly.
So, they need a completely separate data dictionary aside from what you and I think of as a data dictionary. They need it just for a translation purposes.
Right.
Because those interconnections, like if decisions were made in a silo, which they shouldn't be, but if decisions were made in a silo, what we used to do was fine. It wasn't great, but it worked.
Right.
But now IT is not 11 different teams working on 11 different things. It's one team. It's a huge environment where everyone has to share information. So sometimes, like you were talking about the marketing and the accountability, the accounting people and the back and forth, you know, P&L statements being something. The one thing, honestly, the funny one for me, D/L is that download, because that's the way I read it. But to an exchange administrator, that's, you know, distribution list, you know.
Yeah.
These are very simple things that we unfortunately take for granted because we're so used to our spaces. And we need to kind of shift that mindset, especially if you want this data to be good. so we can make decisions on it.
Right. And so in the big management consulting firms like McKinsey studied this, and they realized that the amount of time that, say, the finance team and the operations team had to spend reconciling all these differences wound up in a major difference in the profitability or the ability to respond to certain situations, how much time it took, and time costs money. So it was a big impact on the bottom line if we didn't have these things. And of course, it was even more greatly accelerated and emphasized when everyone started to transition to the cloud, which was quite recent. You know, the pandemic is what really put the accelerator down to the floor for these kinds of movements towards let's getting a governance program set up. It exposed all the weaknesses in not having governance.
Well, a lot of it was, and I came from a networking background. I know you came from a data background, but in networking, we always had the joke that there was that one guy in the basement who knew where all the bodies were buried, and he had the tribal knowledge for years.
Right.
And when you say, okay, well, we're going to, phase that person out, and I'm not saying they did, but they were changing their methodologies, and we're going to be doing it like this, or we're going to do it like that. I can imagine the number of kind of orphaned tribal knowledge nuggets when things got moved to the cloud. And look, this translation thing is an easy one, but there is a whole lot more.
Very true. So it takes more time. There's a lot more pitfalls and traps and so forth when we don't have it, especially at times when we're trying to move to the cloud. But even this particular source is from the Project Management Institute. Of course, lots of great training there for people who want to learn to be Scrum Masters and things like that. And so we're seeing an extreme difference in profitability and the ability to get the projects done in a timely way, predictably and stably, compared to those who do not use these methodologies. And we've got, percentiles there. It's 26% better results for those who are using these different methodologies like Agile and so forth. So what is a major driver for all of the different kinds of ops? We hear about DevOps, we hear about data ops. You may have heard of DevSecOps, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And compared to the old waterfall, we have something in both cases with waterfall and with Agile where we have a Gantt chart. And a Gantt chart tells us our critical path between when we start to build our project and the time we can finish our project. And what are all the extremely important tasks we have to complete between the start of the project and the end. That also brought around this idea of shift left. So I wanted to explain this to you in a couple different ways. So to begin with any kind of project, and in this case, I'm going to use home building. So we're going to build a home, and we start with our plan. We know our requirements. We want 4 bedrooms, 2 full bathrooms, a half bath. We need the 2-car garage, right? So we're planning at this phase. Then we are designing the home. So we get an architect or we look at home plans. And so we're building this house. We now have fixed our sights on exactly the home we want to build. It's a 2-story Tudor, and it has these kinds of landscaping elements and so forth. If we make any changes between the planning phase and when we start construction, it costs only the difference in materials to do that. It's a very easy situation. So if we say, hey, you know what? We want to add a window to the plan. If we do this in the planning and design phase, it's just the cost of a window, right? If we come back, though, later on, and we say, okay, we've already framed the house, but we haven't progressed to doing a lot of work on the house, it's still going to cost. But it's actually going to cost more because we've already framed in stuff. And so to change that, it could be 2 to 4 times more than the cost of the window itself. And if we have already pretty much gone to completion on the house and we realize we need to add a window at this point, It's going to cost 8 to 12 times more than what it would have if we figured it out at the very beginning. That's in a home, building a home. But it's the same way for building with Agile. So if we build with Agile, it is comparatively, and this is well known, and I have the reference down here from ResearchNet, it is comparatively more effective at controlling costs than waterfall. Notice how once we start coding, changes in our waterfall get very expensive. Whereas if we're doing a good job with Agile, it doesn't get really that much more expensive until we get down here to the production phase. Now, if we drill down a little bit deeper, and this is another graph from the ResearchNet organization. So in this case, they even have done analysis for things like when we find defects, according to paired programming, or we found a defect with our continuous integration, continuous deployment. Well, one of the things that is traditionally always held towards a late phase, either at production or even after a system has been rolled, an app has been rolled out into production, is security and the performance tuning of your application. So if you are going to add a whole module for like you have to sign in, and here's the multi-factor authentication, a lot of times that will be added at the end. And that's just as we saw with the home building, it's really expensive to do that.
Like putting locks on the house after you've built the whole house. Oh, and you need a security system, but all those wires have to be run behind the wall. It doesn't make sense to do that near the end. You should have known that in the beginning.
Right. Yeah. And that's a perfect analogy, Kevin. You've already got all the drywall up. You've had the painters come in, and now you're going to rip out drywall to put, or at least drill some holes. Yeah. Not the right way to do that. No. In the same way, many developers, I should say many, almost every developer I've ever worked with, when they look at the requirements, all the requirements that they have are about functionality. The screen needs to do this. When I click this button, here's what I need back. But there are never performance requirements in there. So it never says, it'll say this report needs to look like this, and you'll get a wireframe. But it never says the report needs to retrieve its information in 2 seconds or less.
Yeah.
So
and that leads to an interesting thing, because you've got the performance, and the phrase we hear all the time is MVP, the minimum viable product. It's used in software. It's used in a lot of other places as well. But the minimum is, does it do the thing? But that's feasibility testing. That's
right.
And granted, this all goes back to the PMBOK and the project management guidelines, but that doesn't mean it's useful. I can build a web page in 8 seconds.
Right.
But if it also takes 8 seconds to load, no one's going to visit it. And this is something that you're right. And devs do this because they like doing this kind of work. If you're giving me a wireframe and I actually have the skills, which I do not, but if I did have the skills where I could do really fun jQuery and all of these kind of stuff on the web, then I would really enjoy building that. And the backside, that's not my problem. And sometimes, and I've seen this with a lot of people, speaking with a lot of customers over the years, I'm sure you have, sometimes that's two different teams.
Yeah.
There's the dev team, which is responsible for the UI, the front end, the chef kiss that looks nice. And then there's the other one that's kind of responsible for, I'm going to generically call it the broker service that does the stuff in between it and wherever it's stored. And those teams, although they are working together in pretty much every factor, in a lot of ways, they are still very traditionally, they're working agilely, but they're very much working waterfall, just a little past each other. And then you run into a problem, especially if you push into production. Oh my Lord. Going back at that point is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Can you get it done in a reasonable amount of time? Depending on what it is. Are you going to pay for it? Oh yeah, you are going to pay for that either in dollars, in hours, or in new resources you've got to consume.
Hiring consultants, for example, or that sort of thing. Absolutely true. So what's the solution to this? Well, we have already seen a kind of the birth of DevSecOps, the idea that while we're developing it, our new app, we do our security, we build out our security as we're going along. And what we want to encourage people to do is also to take into account this concept of performance ops, right? It does, in fact, starting back during the heavy cloud migration days of the pandemic, one of the things that I started to tell my customers is slow is the new down. You know, I used to be willing to wait 20 seconds for a web page to load. But nowadays I get annoyed if it's, 2 or 3 seconds. And, and it wasn't even invented a few years ago, but here I am dissatisfied with incredible performance. So this is something that we can do as developers and as application builders, is we can pay attention to performance while we are building the app, rather than rolling it out into production and letting either our end users provide feedback to us about performance. We've lost credibility already, right? They're mad. Or we can, another thing we see very frequently is that the devs will throw the application over the wall to somebody like the DBAs, who now have to tune the SQL queries. And as anyone knows who's talked to a DBA, it's very hard for them to find the time for that. So what really winds up happening is they just take the worst 3 or 4 SQL statements and they tune those. And then everything else, they're like, well, we'll get to it when we can manage.
We'll slap an index on there. This other one kind of bubbled up. You know what? We're going to change the data type you're using here. These are simple things, especially when you're talking about coming from the dev side, where, strings can be stored in multiple different ways. And those are the easy fixes, but that doesn't mean it performs well, because that level of tuning is really dependent on a lot of different layers in the infrastructure, first off, and then also in the DBOS, the network connections there too, the kind of proxy-ish connections that come to and from the broker-ish area. Those things, they all add up, and you have to know. And that's why they got to be involved. I mean, they are like, if we go back to the house analogy, I'm going to make the possibly unpopular assumption that DBAs are plumbers.
Absolutely. We would agree.
They are critical for every portion where you need to get service, water, in your place. So whether it's a bathroom or a kitchen, and these are places you spend a significant amount of time, one way or the other, they are critical. So we want to make sure that they're involved early.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, one thing I want to point out is in our own tools, particularly in SQL Sentry, but it's also something that you can see in some of our other tools, such as SWO, SolarWinds Observability, and what we call HCO, or Hybrid Cloud Observability. What we can do is we can enable you to shift left as part of your dev process. So by pointing a SQL Sentry monitoring service at your dev server, we have some things called advisory conditions. And you can invoke an advisory condition, let's say, every time you do a new deployment to the dev server. And you can see right there on the graph, as you, the various graphs of the of SQL Sentry on the dashboard, you can see right away when you run your user acceptance tests, or maybe even your sniff test, you can see right away whether performance improves, stays the same, or gets worse, right as you're working along. So you might have been tasked this morning with adding a new feature to the product. So you create a table or two, you add some indexes, a primary key, a foreign key, normal stuff. And then you write your stored procedures, perhaps, that are going to interact with the database, or maybe you're using a REST API calls, whatever it is. Then you run your test, and suddenly it's generating 20 times as many forwarded records as it did before you added this feature. Well, now we know right away that this is something that shouldn't go to production as it is. It shouldn't go into the next CI/CD integration there. So it's a very, very powerful feature, not just for the DBAs, who are the traditional monitors of database and application, but for the developers who are building the next generation.
And the great thing about advisory conditions is that they're a lot of times they're community driven because people will be in a scenario. We actually have them up on Thwack under our content exchange. They are available there for download and import directly into your SQL Sentry solution. And they do all manner of things, including stuff that, like, I was shocked to find stuff for AWS databases. I was shocked to find stuff for the Azure databases, just because I have always traditionally thought of the Sentry. I've always thought of the SQL Sentry tool as being an on-premise only, and it's available everywhere.
Yes. And it's also extremely powerful in the type of flexibility that you have. So SQL Sentry is the only tool that can tell you if you have a NUMA node mismatch, for example. Nobody else will be able to do that sort of thing. So very, very powerful. Talking about all of this, let's bring it back around to data ops, okay? So we mentioned how shift left became extremely important, especially when we moved to the cloud because of the pandemic. And so what happened was organizations began to realize that they've been living in silos in their data and analytics department. The salespeople don't connect their sales database to what the marketing people are doing. Maybe they even buy their apps. Maybe the salespeople have subscribed to Salesforce. The marketing team subscribes to Marketo or HubSpot or something like that. So what we found is that organizations are really waking up to the idea that we need some top-down planning. We need to be paying a lot more attention to things like master data management, for example, metadata management. We talked about data dictionaries earlier, data catalogs, right? Also, you pay in the cloud for CPU, for IOPS, and for storage. So in many cases, if the organization had enough hard drives laying around, they'd keep 20 years of data. In the cloud, you will pay for all of that data, the storage of all that data that you don't use very often. So a lot of organizations started to pay a lot more attention to information lifecycle management and archiving and things like that.
Which brings in yet another ops, and I've heard it used a couple ways, but I've heard a lot of people say FinOps, for finance operations.
Yes.
And this is kind of, again, something that really came from the pandemic and the huge cloud adoptions, because when it was on-prem, you could be able to write off for tax purposes, and I'm quoting it wrong, so I'm not an accountant. You could write off the expenditures for 5 years, and the cloud is a subscription, so nothing available. Exactly. So they've had to look at this.
Right. Capital expenditures, which are the amortization schedule of 5 or 7 or 3 years, versus the operational expenses, which are recurring monthly kind of bills that you pay and you write off as soon as you get it, like the lights or your water bill. So we've been able to shift from capital expenses for many IT costs, which we didn't get to do in the past, move that over to operational expenses. And FinOps helps us with that. So we really these concepts have been around for a long time, but not as many people implemented them. In fact, I remember first time I heard a news story about the chief data officer. It was Capital One that created a C-suite position to manage and strategize about all things data in 2006. So it's been around for a while, but not as cohesive and well thought out and vetted and researched. So we began to build this out very strongly at the turn of the century, into the early 2000s. And then as time went on, we began to have growth from there. So we started with broad corporate governance, then into data governance. And the date I'm using here to talk about the origins of data governance, that's the first conference. It's not one the concept. Some of these concepts have been sitting around since mainframe days but for me, I feel like when there's a big conference that attracts a couple thousand people, okay, this is real now. And so data governance started to really kick up in that way back around 2005. And so it takes the idea of compliance and laws about data, all the ideas that we talked about, data quality, metadata management, and risk mitigation. And it brings all of those together into data governance, and that feeds into your broader IT governance plan. Now, compare that to DevOps. The first big DevOps conference happened in 2008. And DevOps doesn't explicitly mean agile. So, but coincidentally, Agile Manifesto came out at about the same time. It ties in, it dovetails perfectly with it. There are some other strategies that can either be complementary or they can be substituted. For example, Kanban, you might have heard of, and Kanban boards. And then there's Scrum, which is a way to do 2-week or incremental sprints. So you can get to that MVP very quickly. And from there, you can iterate and release new versions very quickly. With DevOps, we have these main principles of agile in the sense of keeping this short and flexible. We have the concept or the principle of CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous deployment. We didn't really have products like Git before this. We did have version control systems, but they were pretty cumbersome and they had a lot of administrative overhead. And then the idea of lean, where we want to verify statistically that these workflows are delivering quickly and effectively. So we have all these different kinds of concepts that go into DevOps and other things like automated version control, containers, and DevOps feeds into data governance, right? Then from here, we've got this idea of data ops. And one thing I've heard a lot of people say is, well, isn't that DevOps for data? And actually, it is not. It's a bit of a verbal misdirection. It seems like it would be, but what it really is that what happened again with Web 2.0 as we're going forward is people started to buy their software much more frequently than build it themselves. So we started to have just a plethora of great tools. At one time in the 90s, if you were going to buy software, it either ran on spreadsheets or you had to have your own database. You know, maybe you had DB2 or SQL Server, and you had to have administrators and things. But, you know, around 2010, we saw this huge upturn where we got things like Salesforce, and we got Zoho, and we got Marketo and Buffer, and, you know, all these things that say app.mysoftwarename.com, and you pay by the month. And so data ops was a method of governance and processes that keeps things agile, works in a similar way to DevOps, but it is all about data streams from disparate sources and integrating that data together. So in that early example we gave where the sales team were not talking to the marketing team, so they could never tell if they were actually selling more product when a new marketing campaign went out. Vice versa, the engineers couldn't tell that the new feature they built into the product actually added to sales. So people began to realize we have to bring all of this together. That is what a data ops story is all about.
So I've got a lot of project management experience, and I've got just enough database experience to be incredibly dangerous when speaking to any DBAs out there. But if you had to sum up how data ops, like compares and contrasts with everything we've talked about, how would you sum that up so that I can have an intelligent discussion when speaking with my management?
Right. Great question. And of course, it's a great topic. So you and I could spend another hour or 4 talking about each of these different disciplines and how they all work together and how to make the most of that. And in fact, we do have some other collateral that we have on the topic and would love to share with you. But at the end of the day, what we're looking at isn't necessarily a tools-driven sort of discussion. It's about people, processes, and communication, right? So we start out with this idea of data governance, which helps us ensure strategically data quality, that the data is thoroughly vetted, that it's consistent, that we don't have big gaps in our data. That's the data governance up at the top level. And then from that, we have governance strategies like DevOps, which helps us develop our products in a way that the ops team and the dev team are working together. And because of the cultural mind shift that's different with DevOps than waterfall, we're able to work with velocity. And so we can get that minimal viable product out much faster and then tune it and better align it to the customer's needs with frequent changes over time. And then contrast that to data ops, which incorporates many of those concepts about velocity, about reliability and quality, except data ops now focuses on bringing these disparate chunks of data, silos of data. They could be an application, so forth, and bringing them together or pushing them out to other data consumers. And that takes an entire staff of data engineers or talented data developers to move that around. But then to wrap it all up, we see these trends to shift certain functions of a development project to the left. So we already know all about DevSecOps and getting security early into the development process. And we're proposing that everyone who is developing an application, and almost all applications connect to a database, we're proposing that you should also focus on performance ops. Performance is an afterthought for many organizations. And when you're living in a world that goes at web speed, and we have sayings like slow is the new down, you don't want performance to be an afterthought. So we need to bring that in to early in the dev process. So with that, we have tools specifically for this kind of process that can help you improve that whole DevOps cycle. We have SQL Sentry, which will help with that. We have some of our other tools, which will monitor applications and report on their behavior. And so I hope that you'll take some time to investigate these tools, download the free trials, and spend some time on Thwack, where you can learn a lot about how these programs work, what people love about them in the discussion forums.
Thank you, Kevin. I will 100% agree that we are going to have many more discussions about this. 4 hours might be on the slow time, but you've given me a lot to think about because DevOps, DataOps names are similar and the methodology is kind of aligned, but yeah, we need to think about them in different ways. Yeah. And as the casual DBA, thanks. I really appreciate the help.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, Kevin.